The sun was a hammer, and the land was its anvil. It beat down on the cracked, parched earth until the heat rose in shimmering waves, distorting the horizon into a drunken, wavering line. For 3 days, the silence had been the loudest thing Mira had ever heard. It was a physical weight, pressing in on her, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheel and the tired plodding of the 2 mules. Jedediah and Rue. Now, even that was gone. The axle, a piece of seasoned oak that was supposed to have been invincible, had splintered with a sound like a gunshot, leaving the wagon to list into the dust like a foundering ship. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose face was a roadmap of worry, had stared at the fractured wood with the expression of a preacher seeing a vision of the apocalypse. His wife, a woman as thin and dry as a corn-husk doll, had simply begun to weep, her sobs lost in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Arizona territory. Their 2 young sons, who had been a source of constant, buzzing energy for the last 200 miles, were shocked into a still and fearful silence. Mira stood apart from them, a small calico bag clutched in her hand. It contained everything she owned in the world: a change of clothes, a small, worn Bible, a half-eaten loaf of bread, and a spool of silver thread. The Abernathys had been kind, in their own distracted way. They'd offered her a ride east out of Prescott without asking too many questions, seeing only a girl of 19 with haunted eyes and a desperation that clung to her like trail dust. They didn't know she was running. They didn't know that the questions they hadn't asked were the ones that could get them all killed. "We can't stay here, mister," Abernathy said, his voice raspy. He squinted at the merciless sky. "We'll die of thirst before anyone finds us." He was right. Their water barrel was perilously low, the contents warm and tasting of metal. Mira knew she couldn't stay. To remain with the broken wagon was to wait for him. For them. The thought sent a cold spike of fear through her belly, a chill that had nothing to do with the 100-degree heat. The man she was fleeing, Mr. Silas Thorne, was not a man who forgave slights, and he considered her his property, a thing he had bought and paid for. Her flight was not just an insult, it was theft. Thorne was a man of immense power in this territory, a man whose influence spread like a stain, and his trackers were relentless. They would follow the wagon tracks. Waiting here was not an option. "There was a way station," she said, her voice sounding small and foreign in the open air. "We passed the turnoff maybe 5 miles back, an old one." Mr. Abernathy shook his head. "Abandoned. Girl, there's nothing there." "There might be a well," she insisted, her own hope sounding flimsy even to her ears. "Or shelter. It's a fool's errand." But it was better than no errand at all. Without another word, she adjusted the thin strap of her bag on her shoulder. "I'm going to try. Godspeed to you, Mr. Abernathy, to all of you, all." "Mrs." Abernathy looked at her with wide, fearful eyes, clutching her sons closer. She saw the set of Mira's jaw, the finality in her gaze, and knew there was no arguing. This girl was not simply seeking water. She was running for her life, and her path had just diverged from theirs. The walk was a descent into a private hell. The sun clawed at the back of her neck. Dust, fine as flour, worked its way into her lungs, her eyes, her mouth. The prairie stretched out in every direction, a sea of pale, dried grass and skeletal sagebrush. The silence returned. Deeper now that she was truly alone. She imagined the sound of hoofbeats behind her, a phantom echo that made her heart hammer against her ribs. She forced herself not to look back. Looking back was a luxury she couldn't afford. The way station appeared slowly, a smudge on the horizon that gradually resolved itself into the angular shape of a building. It looked like a skull bleached by the sun. The main structure was built of adobe and rough-hewn timber, sagging in the middle as if it had sighed one last time and given up. A long-gone sign creaked on a single hinge, its words scoured away by wind and sand. The corral was a series of broken sticks jutting from the ground, the gate lying flat, half buried in a dune of red dust. Mr. Abernathy was right. It was a place of ghosts. But it was also shelter. The shadows it cast were deep and cool, a stark promise of relief. As she drew closer, her thirst was a burning coal in her throat. She stumbled toward the main building, her eyes scanning the ground for any sign of a well, a cistern, anything. She found nothing but more dust and the tracks of lizards. The doorway was a dark, gaping mouth. She hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the splintered frame. The air inside was thick with the smell of old wood, animal musk, and something else, something recent. It was the smell of sweat and leather. She was not alone. Her blood ran cold. Her first instinct was to turn and run, to flee back into the punishing sun. But her legs were leaden with exhaustion, and a deeper, more practical part of her knew that running blindly was a death sentence. She forced herself to breathe, to quiet the frantic beating of her heart. Slowly, she let her eyes adjust to the gloom. The interior was cavernous and stark. Most of the roof was gone, allowing pillars of dusty sunlight to spear the darkness. In the far corner, cloaked in the deepest shadows, a figure was hunched over. It took her a moment to make sense of the shape: a man and a horse. The horse, a powerful-looking bay, stood patiently while the man worked on the saddle slung over a rickety sawhorse. He was a cowboy, judging by the worn jeans, the scuffed boots, and the wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face entirely. He moved with an economy of motion, his hands deft and sure as he pulled a leather thong through a stirrup strap. He gave no sign that he had heard her approach. He seemed as much a part of the decaying structure as the timbers and the dust, a solitary creature in its natural habitat. Mira stood frozen in the doorway, a silhouette against the blinding light outside. Every nerve ending screamed at her to be cautious. A lone woman and a strange man in an abandoned place, it was the beginning of a story that rarely ended well for the woman. She watched his hands. They were large, calloused, and steady. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't startled. He was simply working. Her throat was on fire. Her tongue felt thick and useless in her mouth. She swallowed, a painful, rasping sound. The man stopped his work. He didn't look up, didn't turn his head, but he had heard her. The stillness in his posture was an acknowledgement. For a long moment, the only sound was the sigh of the wind through the broken walls. Then, slowly, he lifted one hand. He didn't point it at her, but to his left, toward a large, flat rock near the back wall. His finger extended, indicating a dark, damp patch on the stone. It was a shallow basin, no bigger than a dinner plate, filled with the murky remnants of the last rainstorm. It was not an invitation. It was a statement of fact. There is water. Mira's caution warred with her desperate need. She watched him for another second. He had already returned to his task, his head bent, the brim of his hat hiding his intentions. He had offered the barest minimum of civility, a gesture so impersonal it was hardly a gesture at all. It was this very impersonality that reassured her. He wasn't trying to lure her in, wasn't offering a kind word to soften her up. He was a rock, a tree, a feature of the landscape that had simply noted her existence. She moved carefully, her worn boots making no sound on the packed earth floor. She kept her distance from him, skirting the edge of the room until she reached the rock. She knelt, her knees protesting. The water was cloudy, with bits of dirt and leaves floating in it, but it was wet, cupping her hands. She lifted the tepid water to her lips and drank. It tasted of stone and sky. She drank again and again, the relief so profound it was painful. Life, which had felt so thin and fragile moments before, began to seep back into her. When her thirst was finally slaked, she didn't stand up. Her energy was gone. She sank down, her back resting against the cool adobe wall, and drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. Her calico bag lay beside her. From this vantage point, She could see the man more clearly, though his face remained a mystery beneath his hat. He was lean but broad in the shoulder, his shirt patched at the elbow. A holstered pistol hung low on his hip, the leather worn smooth with use. It was a common enough sight in this country, but on him, it looked less like an accessory and more like a part of his body, an extension of his arm. He finished his repair, testing the strap with a firm tug. Satisfied, he swung the heavy saddle onto the bay's back with a single, fluid motion. The horse shifted its weight but made no complaint. He moved around the animal, checking the cinch, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was a man accustomed to solitude, comfortable in the silence. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Mira watched the sun crawl across the sky through the holes in the roof. The light began to soften, the brutal white glare mellowing to a warmer gold. Evening was coming. The thought of spending the night here with this silent stranger sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. But the thought of being out there, in the open dark, was infinitely worse. At least here there were walls. She had to say something. The quiet was becoming a scream in her head. She cleared her throat. The sound small and scratchy. If they come looking, the words were out before she could stop them. A whisper of her deepest fear-given voice. It wasn't a question directed at him. It was for herself, for the uncaring gods of the desert. She didn't expect an answer. The cowboy, Calder, didn't so much as flinch. His hands continued to move, tightening a buckle on the bridle. The brim of his hat dipped a fraction of an inch as he focused on the task. For a moment, Mira was certain he hadn't heard her, that her words had been just another rustle of the wind. Then, his voice came out of the shadows, low and rough, like stones grinding together. He didn't raise his head. He didn't stop his work. Then they better come ready. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't an offer of protection. It was a simple, unadorned statement of fact. It was the credo of a man who had survived this long by being harder than the land he lived on. But for Mira, huddled in the fading light, those 6 words were the first solid thing she had felt in weeks. They were a shield, a wall, a piece of high ground. They didn't banish her fear, but they gave it a boundary. The night was coming, and the men who hunted her were out there somewhere under the same cooling sky. But inside this ruin, there was a man who was ready. And, for now, that was enough. Night did not fall in the desert. It rose from the ground. As the last embers of sunset were extinguished on the western horizon, a deep, profound chill seeped out of the earth, climbing the walls of the ruined way station and laying its cold hand on everything it touched. The heat of the day was a distant, almost unbelievable memory. This was a cold that felt ancient and predatory. It sought out the thinnest parts of a person's clothing, the smallest gaps in their defenses, and worked its way inward until it settled deep in the bone. Mira was curled into the tightest ball she could manage, her arms wrapped around her shins, her chin tucked to her knees. She had chosen a corner where 2 of the adobe walls were mostly intact, hoping to find some shelter from the wind that now moaned through the building's skeletal frame. It was no use. The cold was a patient adversary. It found her anyway. Her thin cotton dress, practical for the daytime heat, was now a useless sheath. A shiver started in her spine and radiated outward in a violent, uncontrollable tremor. Across the cavernous room, the cowboy, Calder, had made a fire. It was a small, disciplined thing, built in the center of the floor where the smoke could find its way out through the missing roof. He had used dry sagebrush and a few precious pieces of wood scavenged from the wreckage of a collapsed stall. The flames were a tight knot of orange and yellow, consuming the fuel with a quiet, hungry crackle. It was just enough to push back the immediate darkness and create a small circle of warmth, a temporary island in an ocean of cold. He sat on his heels beside it, one hand resting on his knee. His hat was still pulled low, and the firelight cast dancing shadows upwards. carving deep lines into the lower half of his face. His jaw was firm, his mouth a straight, unreadable line. He seemed perfectly at ease, a man who had spent 1,000 nights just like this one. He fed the fire sparingly, adding a stick now and then with a deliberate, unhurried motion. He was conserving fuel, a man who understood that the night was long and resources were finite. Mira watched him. She couldn't sleep. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was a hive of frantic activity. Every gust of wind sounded like the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Every shadow that danced and flickered at the edge of the firelight seemed to take the shape of a man. She thought of Silas Thorne, of his cold, possessive eyes and the way his smile never reached them. He would not give up easily. He saw her as an investment that had defaulted, and he would spare no expense to reclaim his property. The fear was a physical thing, a sour taste at the back of her throat. And then there was this man, this silent, watchful stranger. His earlier words, "Then they better come ready," echoed in her mind. It hadn't been a boast. It had been a statement of capability, as plain and solid as the rock beneath her. But who was he? Men in this land were rarely charitable without reason. Kindness was a currency, and she had nothing to pay with. Every man she had ever known, from her own father who had traded her to settle a debt, to Thorne who had sought to own her body and soul, had wanted something. This man, so far, had wanted nothing. He had not asked her name. He had not asked where she was from or where she was going. He had not even truly looked at her. This absence of inquiry was more unnerving than 100 questions. It left a vacuum she felt compelled to fill. She watched him poke the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks spiraling up into the darkness. He moved with a kind of profound stillness, as if his very presence was an anchor in the shifting world. He was a mystery, and in her fear, she found she could not bear a mystery. She needed to know. She needed to understand the ground she was standing on, even if it was barren rock. Her voice, when it came, was a fragile thing, nearly lost to the wind and the fire. "Why didn't you ask what I did?" He stopped, the stick held motionless over the flames. He didn't turn. He didn't look at her. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of her question. She thought for a moment he would not answer, that he would simply ignore her as he had ignored the cold. Her cheeks burned with a sudden shame for having spoken, for having revealed a crack in her own composure. He slowly lowered the stick and set it beside him. He turned his head, not enough to face her fully, but enough that she could feel the weight of his attention. The firelight caught the underside of his hat's brim, but his eyes remained in shadow. "Don't need to—" The words were rough, yet they carried no judgment, just a flat finality. It was an answer that was not an answer, yet it told her more than a long speech would have. "Don't need to." It meant he'd seen her kind before, a woman alone, running scared, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a story in her eyes. The details, he seemed to imply, were irrelevant. The sin or the injustice that had set her on this path didn't change the fact that she was here, now, cold and afraid. He wasn't a priest or a judge. He was just a man sitting by a fire. Another violent shiver racked her body, so strong it made her teeth click together. He saw it. He must have. Without another word, he reached for the worn, heavy bedroll that lay beside him. It was made of thick canvas and lined with wool, a dark, reassuring bulk. He didn't unroll it. He simply picked it up and, with a slight flick of his wrist, tossed it so that it landed on the packed earth a few feet from her. The sound was a soft thud. An offer, a real one. Not a puddle of water, but his own warmth, his own comfort. Mira stared at the bedroll as if it were a coiled snake. Her heart began to beat a frantic, panicked rhythm. Nothing was free. A blanket from a strange man in the middle of the night was never just a blanket. It was a down payment. It was an invitation. It was a debt. Her whole body tensed, ready to refuse, ready to endure the cold rather than risk the price of his charity. She looked from the bedroll to him, trying to penetrate the shadows that guarded his face, searching for the glint of expectation, the hint of a transaction. She found nothing. He had already turned back to the fire, his posture unchanged, his attention seemingly fixed on the licking flames. He was not looking at her. He was not waiting for her gratitude or her refusal. He had seen a need and provided a solution. The rest was up to her. The cold was a compelling argument. It was not a potential danger. It was a present and relentless misery. It was draining her strength, making her thoughts sluggish. To refuse the blanket was an act of pride, and pride was a foolish thing to die for. Slowly, cautiously, as if moving through deep water, she pushed herself to her feet. Her joints ached. Every muscle protested. She took a step, then another, her worn boots silent on the floor. She stopped beside the bedroll, looking down at it. It smelled of canvas, horse, and the clean, sharp scent of the desert night. She looked at him one last time. He did not move. With trembling fingers, she picked it up. It was heavier than she expected, a solid, substantial weight. She didn't unroll it. She hugged it to her chest, a shield of wool and canvas. She took a few hesitant steps closer to the fire, drawn by the pull of its heat. She stopped about 6 feet from him, unsure of what to do next. He seemed to sense her uncertainty. He shifted his position, moving a little to one side. He didn't speak, but the movement was an instruction. He was making a space for her, a space by the fire, within the small circle of warmth. He leaned back slightly against his saddle, which he'd propped against a broken timber, and angled his body so that his broad back and the heavy leather of his duster created a small break against the wind that funneled through the doorway. Mira hesitated for a heartbeat longer. Then, the decision made, she moved. She settled onto the ground in the space he had created, keeping a careful distance between them. There was no risk of them touching, but she was close enough now to feel the heat from the fire on her face, and to be sheltered from the worst of the draft by his silent, solid form. She draped the heavy bedroll over her shoulders. The wool was coarse against her skin, but it held a reservoir of warmth, and it immediately began to fight back the invasive cold. The silence returned, but its character had changed again. It was no longer a void of suspicion, but a shared space of quiet endurance. They sat like that for a long time, two solitary figures illuminated by a dying fire, listening to the vast, lonely symphony of the desert night. Mira found her shivering subsiding. The warmth from the fire and the heavy blanket began to work its way into her, unknotting the tight, cold muscles in her back and shoulders. She felt a profound and weary gratitude that was so overwhelming it almost felt like grief. For the first time in days, she was not utterly, terrifyingly alone. He must have felt the change in her, the slight relaxing of her posture. He spoke without looking at her, his voice low, meant only for her and the fire. "You're safe for the night," he said. And then, after a pause, he added, "That's all we need for now." The words were a balm. He wasn't offering forever. He wasn't making promises the desert would surely break. He was offering the now. This night, this fire, this small, temporary truce with the vast and dangerous world. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her, under the weight of that simple, profound honesty. Mira felt her eyelids grow heavy. She pulled the bedroll tighter, let her head droop, and for the first time since she had fled into the unforgiving wilderness, she began to drift toward sleep. Morning arrived, not with a bang, but with a whisper. A pale, ethereal light crept over the eastern mountains, spilling across the desert floor like watered-down milk. It was a gentle, forgiving light that softened the harsh edges of the landscape and painted the world in shades of lavender and rose. The air was still and cold, so clean and sharp it felt like drinking ice water. Mira woke to the smell of coffee. It was a scent so profoundly normal, so tied to a life she thought she had lost forever, that for a moment she was disoriented. She was still huddled under the heavy weight of the cowboy's bedroll, her body stiff and protesting from its night on the hard-packed earth. The fire had been rekindled, a small, cheerful pyramid of flames that crackled softly. Calder was hunkered down beside it, tending to a small, battered tin pot that sat nestled in the coals. He seemed not to have slept at all, or perhaps he was the kind of man who slept with his eyes open, never fully relinquishing his watch. He glanced over as she stirred, his expression unreadable in the pre-dawn gloom. He gave a slight nod toward a tin cup sitting on a rock near her. It was an invitation. She sat up, the bedroll pooling around her waist, and poured a little of the steaming liquid into the cup. It was black and bitter, but it was hot, and the warmth spread through her chest, chasing away the last of the night's deep chill. She drank it slowly, watching him over the rim of the cup. He was not looking at her. His attention was focused on a piece of his gear. It was a rein, the leather dark with age and use, and in one spot near the bit loop, it was dangerously frayed. The outer layer of leather had worn away, revealing the weaker fibers within. A rein like that could snap at the worst possible moment, turning a crisis into a catastrophe. He was mending it. From a small leather pouch, he took out an awl, a spool of waxed linen thread, and a block of beeswax. His movements were economical and precise. He laid the frayed rein across his knee and, with the sharp point of the awl, pierced a neat row of holes on either side of the worn section. Then he threaded a needle, ran the thread through the beeswax to waterproof and strengthen it, and began to stitch. His hands, which she had noted before, were captivating to watch. They were not the hands of a gentleman. They were scarred and calloused, the knuckles prominent, the fingernails blunt and clean. Yet they moved with an artisan's grace. He pushed the needle through the tough leather, his thumb guiding the point, then drew the thread taut with a firm, practiced pull, back and forth. He created a saddle stitch, the strongest stitch there is, forming a neat, interlocking pattern that drew the worn edges of the leather together. It was a slow, patient, methodical process. It was an act of preservation. Watching him work stirred something deep inside Mira, the rhythmic push and pull of the needle, the focus in his posture, the quiet competence of his hands. It was all achingly familiar. It reminded her of her mother. Her mother's hands had been different, softer and more nimble, but they had possessed the same quiet authority. Mira's earliest memories were of sitting on the floor of their small seamstress shop in Prescott, surrounded by bolts of calico, gingham, and fine lawn. The air was always filled with the scent of hot irons and fresh linen, and the soundtrack of her childhood was the gentle hum of her mother's singer machine. Her mother could take a simple piece of cloth and, with her shears and needles, transform it into something of beauty and purpose. She taught Mira the language of fabric, the personalities of different stitches, the strong, utilitarian backstitch, the delicate, decorative chain stitch, the nearly invisible slip stitch for a perfect hem. A good stitch holds the world together. Mira girl, her mother used to say, her mouth full of pins. Never forget that. Calder finished a line of stitching and paused, testing the strength of the repair with a powerful tug. The threads held firm. He seemed to feel her watching him, and he glanced at her, a silent, questioning look. The story was a stone in her throat, but the sight of his patient mending had loosened it. It had to come out. She had to give this man, who had offered her warmth and safety without asking for a single thing in return, some piece of the truth. "My mother was a seamstress," she began, her voice quiet and raspy. The words felt strange, like speaking a language she hadn't used in years. Calder didn't reply, but he stopped his work. He rested his hands on his knee, the needle and thread held loosely, and gave her his full attention. He was listening. She was the best in the county. People would come all the way from Flagstaff for her to make a wedding dress or a Sunday suit. She taught me everything: how to measure and cut, how to read the grain of the fabric. Mira's gaze became distant, lost in the memory. We had this one spool of thread. It was pure silver, an indulgence, my father called it. But my mother said some things required more than cotton. She used it for the most special work, embroidering a flower on a bride's veil or a monogram on a gentleman's shirt. It was like stitching with moonlight. She paused, taking a shaky breath. The memory was so clear, so sweet, that it was painful. That little shop had been her entire world, a safe harbor of creativity and love. But my father, he was a good man, but he had bad luck. A failed mine, a bad crop. He borrowed money. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. He borrowed it from Mr. Silas Thorne. At the mention of the name, a shadow seemed to pass over her face. She felt the same suffocating pressure she had felt the day Thorne had first come to their shop to collect. He wasn't a loud or overtly threatening man. His menace was quiet, confident. He was a large man, built like a bull, always dressed in a tailored black coat. No matter the heat, he filled every room he entered, his presence consuming all the available air. He had looked around their small, tidy shop, his eyes lingering on the fine fabrics. And then they had settled on her. She had been 17. Mr. Thorne owned the largest ranch in the territory. He owned everything and everyone around it, Mira continued, her voice dropping lower. When my father couldn't pay, Thorne made him another offer, a way to clear the entire debt. Calder remained silent, his posture unwavering. He was a statue, a sentinel, giving her the space she needed to let the poison out. He wanted me, the words were barely a whisper, to be his wife. My father, he saw it as a salvation. He told me it would be a good life, that I would have fine things, a big house. He didn't understand that some cages are gilded. She fell silent, lost in the memory of the wedding. It had been a small, joyless affair. She had worn a dress of the finest silk, sewn by her own mother, whose hands had trembled the entire time. The silver thread had remained on its spool. There was nothing worth celebrating. Life in Thorne's house had been an exercise in slow suffocation. He was a man obsessed with ownership. He took a perverse pleasure in surrounding himself with beautiful things he could control. His prize horses, his imported furniture, his young wife. He was meticulously cruel, his words designed to chip away at her spirit. He belittled her skills, calling her sewing a peasant's hobby. He was intensely, pathologically jealous. She was not allowed to speak to the ranch hands. Her trips into town were infrequent and always chaperoned. He wanted her to be nothing more than another beautiful object in his collection, an exquisite doll with no thoughts or feelings of her own. He demanded she bow her head, not just in public, but in her very soul. He wanted to break me, she said, the words stark in the quiet morning. He wanted me to forget who I was, that I was a seamstress's daughter. He wanted me to be his, nothing more. One night, she had reached her limit. He had found her humming a tune her mother used to sing while she worked. He had told her to stop, that the noise was common and displeased him. It was a small thing, a trivial cruelty, but it was the final cut. That night, she lay awake in the vast, silent house, listening to his heavy breathing from the adjoining room. She knew that if she stayed, the girl who loved the smell of linen and the gleam of silver thread would be gone forever, buried under the weight of his suffocating possession. So I ran. She looked up from her hands and met Calder's gaze, or at least the deep shadow where his gaze must be. I waited until he was asleep. I took a small bag, some food from the pantry. I didn't take any of the jewelry he gave me. I didn't take any of the silk dresses. I only took one thing that was mine. She reached into the calico bag at her side, and her fingers closed around a familiar object. She pulled out the spool of silver thread. She held it out on the palm of her hand. In the soft morning light, the thread shimmered. A small, captured piece of the moon. It looked impossibly delicate. yet it was the strongest thing she owned. The story was finished. The stone was gone from her throat, leaving behind a raw, hollow ache. A terrible vulnerability washed over her. She had laid the ugliest parts of her life at this stranger's feet. She had shown him her weakness, her desperation. Now came the judgment. In her experience, the world was quick to blame a woman, a disobedient daughter, a runaway wife, a sinner. Her voice trembled as she asked the question that had been haunting her every step of her journey.
Do you think I was wrong?
Calder did not answer right away. The silence stretched, long and deep. He lowered his gaze from her face to the spool of thread shining in her palm, then back to his own hands. Still holding the half-mended rein, he picked up his needle. With a deliberate motion, he pushed it through the last hole in the leather. He wrapped the thread around the needle, looped it, and pulled the stitch tight, knotting it off with a final, decisive tug. The repair was complete. He tested it one last time, pulling on the rein with his full strength. It held. Only then did he look at her, and for the first time, the light caught him just right. She could see his eyes beneath the brim of his hat. They were a pale, clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held no judgment at all. They held only a quiet, weary understanding. He let out a slow breath.
You ran,
he said, his voice a low rumble. That's survival, not sin. The words landed in the center of her being, and the hollow ache inside her bloomed into a strange and painful relief. Survival, not sin. He had not judged her. He had not questioned her. He had simply reframed her entire reality with 4 simple words. He had taken the brand of shame she had been carrying and wiped it clean. She had not committed a transgression against God or man. She had committed an act of survival, as natural and necessary as a starving animal seeking food or a freezing man seeking fire. In the brutal, honest world he inhabited, survival was the only law that mattered. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She simply looked at him, this silent cowboy mending his rein, and felt the first, fragile thread of trust stitch itself between them, strong and true. The fragile peace of the morning was a memory, thin and ephemeral as a ghost. Calder's words, survival, not sin, still echoed in Mira's soul. A quiet affirmation that had begun to mend something she hadn't known was so broken. She had even allowed herself a small, dangerous flicker of hope. But hope, in this land, was a fool's currency. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning's gentleness and restoring its familiar, tyrannical heat. The silence of the desert returned, but it was no longer peaceful. It was watchful, tense. Calder had finished his coffee and was standing near the gaping doorway, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon. He had been standing there, motionless, for several minutes. His stillness was not the relaxed posture of a man at rest. It was the coiled, absolute stillness of a predator that has caught a scent on the wind. Mira, packing her few belongings back into her calico bag, felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hushed. He didn't answer immediately. He lifted a hand to shield his eyes. Though his hat already cast his face in deep shadow, he was a silhouette against the blinding glare of the plains. "Dust," he said, his voice flat. "A lot of it, moving fast." Mira's blood went cold. She scrambled to her feet and stood beside him, peering into the shimmering distance. At first, she saw nothing but the endless, pale expanse of baked earth and sky. Then she saw it. A faint, brownish smudge against the crystalline blue, low on the horizon. It was indistinct, but it was unmistakably the plume of dust kicked up by a group of riders, and they were coming this way. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. It was a physical assault, stealing the air from her lungs and turning her limbs to ice. Her mind screamed, "Thorn! It's him! He's found me!" The fragile shelter of the way station instantly transformed into a trap. The walls that had offered comfort now felt like they were closing in. Her first primal instinct was to run, to hide, to burrow into the earth like a terrified animal. She looked around wildly, her eyes darting from one crumbling wall to the next, seeing no escape. "We have to hide," she gasped, her voice thin with terror.
They'll see the horse.
Calder's reaction was the complete antithesis of her panic. He did not freeze. He did not run. He moved with a swift and terrifying purpose. The time for stillness was over. "No time to hide," he grunted, turning from the doorway. In 2 long strides, he was at the fire. With the heel of his boot, he kicked the packed earth at the edge of the fire pit, scattering sand and dirt over the embers. A hiss of steam, a puff of gray smoke, and the small beacon of their existence was extinguished. The scent of scorched coffee and wet ash filled the air. He moved to his horse, Valor, who had been standing patiently in the corner. The bay tossed its head, sensing the sudden urgency in its master. Calder didn't soothe the animal with a soft word. He communicated his intent through his hands. Through the swift, sure way he checked the saddle's cinch, pulling the leather strap with a grunt of effort. He grabbed his bedroll and saddlebags, which he had already packed, and tied them down behind the cantle with a series of knots that seemed to materialize from the blur of his fingers. Mira stood frozen, a spectator to his storm of activity. He was a whirlwind of efficient motion, each action stripped down to its barest, most vital necessity. He was not preparing to flee. He was preparing for war. When the horse was ready, he turned to her. He didn't speak. He simply strode toward her, his face a grim, unreadable mask under the shadow of his hat. He reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip was not rough, but it was as unyielding as iron. It was the grip of a man who would not be disobeyed, who had no time for fear or hesitation. He pulled her toward the horse. "Get up," he ordered. Valor was a big horse, and the saddle was high off the ground. In her panic, Mira's limbs felt clumsy and uncooperative. She fumbled for the stirrup, her foot slipping, with a sound of pure impatience. Calder put a hand on her waist and practically threw her into the saddle. She landed awkwardly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Before she could even find her balance, he had swung up behind her, his body a solid, warm wall against her back. He reached around her, taking the newly mended reins in one hand and grabbing the saddle horn with the other. "Hold on to the horn," he commanded, his voice a low growl right next to her ear. "Don't let go, no matter what." He nudged the horse with his heels, and Valor leaped forward, clearing the doorway in a single, powerful bound and bursting out into the merciless sunlight. The sudden acceleration threw Mira back against Calder's chest. His arm instinctively tightened around her middle, holding her in place. "We ride west," he said, his voice tight against the rising wind. "No trail." West was toward the broken country, a labyrinth of sun-scorched mesas and shadowed canyons that most men, even trackers, avoided. No trail meant they would leave the faint, hard-packed wagon ruts and strike out across the virgin desert, a place with no landmarks and 1,000 places to die. It was a desperate gamble. The ride was a brutal, jarring assault on the senses. Valor was not cantering. He was at a full, ground-eating gallop. The powerful muscles of the horse worked beneath them, a relentless engine of flesh and bone. The pounding of his hooves was a frantic drumbeat, the only sound in a world that had been reduced to speed and dust. The wind tore at Mira's hair, whipping it across her face, stinging her eyes. She clung to the saddle horn with a white-knuckled grip, her body lurching with every stride. Calder steered them toward a vast, shimmering flat dotted with the skeletal shapes of shoya cactus. From a distance, they looked like ghostly sentinels. Up close, they were fortifications of pure malice, each one covered in 1,000,000 tiny, barbed spines that could leap onto a passerby with the slightest touch. A sane man would ride miles to go around such a place. Calder plunged directly into it. He guided Valor with an uncanny skill, his knees and the subtle pressure of the reins directing the horse through the treacherous maze. They weaved and dodged, the horse's hooves kicking up spurts of sand. Mira flinched as the spiny arms of the cholla reached for them, close enough to tear her dress, to rip at her skin. She could feel the tension in Calder's body, the constant, minute adjustments he made to keep them safe. He was using the hostile landscape as a shield, choosing a path so dangerous that their pursuers might hesitate to follow. They cleared the cactus field and entered a wide, dry wash, the ground a treacherous mix of soft sand and loose rock. The wash twisted and turned, its high, crumbling walls creating a claustrophobic channel. The sound of Valor's hooves was amplified here, a clattering echo that seemed to advertise their position to the entire world. Mira risked a glance over her shoulder. The dust cloud was larger now, closer. She could almost make out the dark, insect-like shapes of individual riders. A fresh wave of nausea and terror washed over her.
"They're still coming,"
she cried, her voice stolen by the wind. Calder's only response was to urge the horse faster. He leaned low over her, his chest pressing against her back, his breath hot on her neck. "Hold on," he yelled, his voice raw. The wash ended abruptly, spilling them out onto a steep, rocky slope that led up to a high mesa. It was a wall of shattered rock and scree, a place where a man on foot would struggle to find purchase. There was no trail. Calder didn't hesitate. He gave Valor his head, and the magnificent horse began to climb, its powerful haunches bunching and releasing, its hooves scrabbling for purchase on the loose rock. It was on this perilous ascent that it happened. A rock, dislodged by Valor's front hoof, skittered away. The horse stumbled, its body lurching violently to the side. The sudden, sickening motion broke Mira's desperate grip on the saddle horn. She cried out as she was thrown sideways, her body sliding from the saddle, her feet scrabbling for a hold that wasn't there. For one heart-stopping moment, she was falling. The ground rushed up to meet her, a brutal expanse of sharp-edged rock. Before the terror could fully register, an iron band clamped around her waist. Calder, in an incredible feat of strength and balance, had thrown his own weight to the opposite side, anchoring himself while his arm shot out and snared her. He grunted with the effort, the muscles in his arm and back straining as he hauled her back from the brink. He dragged her across the saddle, her body limp with shock, until she was pressed against him. Safe. The entire event had taken less than 2 seconds. Valor found its footing and stood for a moment, sides heaving, trembling with exertion. The world was suddenly, ringingly silent except for the rasp of their breathing and the frantic pounding of Mira's own heart. She was crushed against Calder's chest, his arm still locked around her face buried in the rough fabric of his shirt. It smelled of dust, sweat, and horse. It smelled of safety. He held her there for a moment longer, letting the horse and themselves recover. Then, his voice came, a low, rough rasp right beside her ear. It was not gentle. It was not kind. It was fierce, breathless, and edged with something that sounded almost like anger. "I said you're safe, didn't I?" He was not asking a question. He was issuing a reminder, a command, a furious reaffirmation of a promise made in the dark. He shifted his weight, urging Valor onward and upward, resuming the impossible climb. Mira didn't try to regain her seat properly. She just clung to him, her terror finally giving way to a raw, absolute trust in the man who held her, a man who had just thrown himself between her and the unforgiving rock of the desert floor. They reached the top of the mesa and galloped on, 2 figures fleeing across the roof of the world, a cloud of dust rising behind them. They rode until the sun was a bruised purple smear in the western sky, and the horse, Valor, was slick with sweat, his breath coming in ragged, steaming bursts. The frantic energy of the chase had long since burned away, replaced by a deep, bone-grinding exhaustion. They had pushed man and beast to their absolute limit, crossing a landscape so broken and desolate it felt like the world's raw, unfinished edge. Mira had lost all track of time and direction, clinging to Calder's back, her world reduced to the rhythmic, jarring motion of the horse and the solid wall of his body shielding her from the wind. She did not know when they lost their pursuers. There was no clear moment of victory, no triumphant backward glance. There was only the gradual, dawning realization that the vast, empty space behind them remained empty. The dust cloud had vanished, either given up or swallowed by the labyrinth of rock they had navigated. Calder finally slowed Valor to a walk, the horse's hooves picking carefully through a narrow, winding canyon. The walls rose up on either side, sheer cliffs of red and ochre sandstone, so close in places that Mira could have reached out and touched them both. The temperature dropped as they descended deeper into the earth's embrace, the air growing cool and still. The sounds of their passage, the creak of leather, the horse's tired breathing, the scuff of hoof on rock were muted, swallowed by the immense silence of the stone. He led them not to a cave, but to a place that was even better. It was a deep, semicircular hollow carved into the base of the canyon wall, a natural amphitheater sculpted by millennia of wind and water. A massive overhang of rock created a perfect, solid roof, sheltering a wide, sandy floor from the elements. On one side, a thin, silver ribbon of water trickled down a fissure in the rock face, collecting in a clear, stone-lined pool before disappearing into the sand. A few hardy, twisted junipers clung to life in the cracks, their dark green foliage a startling splash of color against the red rock. It was a sanctuary, a place hidden from the sky, shielded from the wind, and blessed with the impossible gift of fresh water. It felt secret, ancient, and utterly safe. Calder slid from the saddle, his movements stiff with fatigue. He stood for a moment, his hand resting on Valor's neck, his head bowed. Man and horse seemed to share a single, profound exhalation of relief. He then turned and reached up for Mira. His hands went to her waist, and this time there was no frantic urgency. His touch was firm but careful as he lifted her down, her legs, numb and useless after so many hours in the saddle, buckled the moment her feet touched the ground. He caught her easily, his arms steadying her until she found her balance, his hands lingering at her waist for a second longer than was strictly necessary before he let go. Without a word, he began the slow, methodical process of unsaddling the horse. He worked with the quiet reverence of a man performing a sacred ritual, his movements economical despite his exhaustion. He rubbed the horse down with a handful of dry grass, his hands moving over the animal's powerful muscles, checking for any sign of injury. Mira watched him for a moment. Then her eyes were drawn to the pool of water. It was a magnet, pulling her with an irresistible force. She limped over to the edge, her whole body aching. The water was so clear she could see every colored pebble on the bottom. She sank to her knees on a flat, smooth rock and, after a moment's hesitation, untied the laces of her worn, dusty boots. Peeling off her stockings, she plunged her feet into the pool. The cold was a shocking, breathtaking jolt. It was so intense it felt like a flame, burning away the grime, the heat, and the terror of the day. The pain was exquisite. It was the feeling of life rushing back into a part of her that had gone numb. She gasped, leaning forward and bracing her hands on the rock, watching as clouds of trail dust dissolved from her skin, turning the water around her feet murky before the gentle current carried it all away. She washed away the memory of the stumbling horse, the fall that almost was, the bruising grip of fear. She was cleansing herself, not just of the journey, but of the life that had led her to it. When she finally drew her feet out, her skin was pink and tingling, every nerve ending awake and alive. By the time she had dried her feet on the hem of her petticoat and pulled her boots back on, Calder had a fire going. He had found a natural fire pit, a circle of blackened stones left from some previous visit, perhaps his own. The fire he built was not the small, cautious flame of the way station. This was a generous, confident fire, made from the dry, dead branches of the junipers, It blazed brightly, its warmth pushing back the encroaching chill of the evening and painting the rock walls of their hollow in dancing shades of orange and gold. The flames leaped and crackled, a cheerful, defiant sound in the deep quiet. He had laid out their meager provisions on a flat rock near the fire, a strip of dried beef, hard as wood, and the last of his coffee. He sawed off pieces of the beef with his knife and handed one to her. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic chewing of their own jaws. The meat was salty and tough, requiring a great deal of effort, but it was sustenance. It was fuel for bodies that had been running on fear and adrenaline for hours. When they were finished, Calder took his saddle and placed it near the fire, laying it on its side so that the seat, worn smooth and curved from countless hours of use, faced upward. It was meant to be a backrest, a pillow. He then took his bedroll and spread it out on the sand, a single blanket for a mattress. He gestured for her to take the spot with the saddle. "You'll be warmer there," he said. It was not a suggestion. She didn't argue. She was too tired. She settled onto the bedroll, her back against the firm curve of the saddle. It was surprisingly comfortable. The leather held the day's warmth, and it cradled her shoulders perfectly. Calder sat on the other side of the fire, his back against the rock wall, his knees drawn up. He took off his hat and set it on the sand beside him. It was the first time she had truly seen his face. He was not handsome in the way of the fine gentleman in Prescott. His was a face carved by sun and wind, not shaped by soft living. His dark hair was shaggy, in need of a cut. There were lines around his eyes, etched there by years of squinting into the sun, and a faint, white scar that cut through one of his eyebrows. His jaw was square and stubborn. It was a hard face, a lonely face, but in the flickering firelight, the hardness was softened. She saw the weariness in the set of his mouth and the profound, quiet intelligence in his pale gray eyes. They were eyes that saw everything and said little. They sat like that for a long time, sharing the silence. It was a comfortable silence now, woven from shared exhaustion and the unspoken bond of a trial survived. Outside their hollow, the world was a dangerous, predatory place. But in here, with the fire and the stone and the sound of trickling water, there was a profound sense of peace. Mira thought about the spool of silver thread in her bag. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had shown it to him, that she had unburdened her story in the gray light of dawn. So much had happened since then. He had saved her life. Not once, but twice. He had asked for nothing. He had simply acted. He had shared his fire, his water, his food, his blanket. He had given her a shield made of his own body. A question began to form in her mind, a quiet, vulnerable thing. What would happen tomorrow? And the day after, this sanctuary was temporary. Sooner or later, they would have to leave. They would go their separate ways. He would ride on, a solitary figure disappearing into the vastness of the territory. And she would have to find a town, a new life, a way to become someone else. The thought of it, of being alone again, was a cold fist clenching in her gut. This time together, this frantic, terrifying, and strangely peaceful interlude, felt like a story complete in itself. But stories ended. People moved on. She would remember him. She would remember the quiet competence of his hands, the solid feel of his back as they rode, the fierce blaze in his voice when he'd pulled her back from the fall. She would remember every detail. But would he remember her? Or would she just be another bit of trouble he'd encountered on the trail? A fleeting responsibility. Forgotten as soon as she was out of sight, the thought was unbearable. She looked at him across the fire. He was staring into the flames, his expression distant, lost in his own thoughts. Her voice was so quiet, she wasn't sure he would hear it over the crackle of the fire. "If we survive," she began, her throat tight, "will you remember me?" He didn't move for a long moment. The firelight danced in his pale eyes. making them seem luminous. He slowly raised his head, his gaze leaving the flames and finding hers. He looked at her, and in that long, silent look, she felt he was seeing all the way to the bottom of her. He saw the frightened girl from the way station, the seamstress's daughter with the story of a gilded cage, the terrified woman on the back of his horse. He saw everything. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough murmur, but it carried across the fire with an absolute, unshakable clarity. Every thread, his promise, every thread, hung in the quiet air of the hollow long after the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, ruby-red coals. It was a vow made not with the flourish of a poet, but with the stark, unadorned gravity of a man who weighed his words as carefully as he measured his water, in the safety of the rock-walled sanctuary. Mira slept a sleep deeper and more profound than any she had known in years. It was a sleep without pursuit, without fear, a sleep anchored by the presence of the man who lay on the other side of the dead fire, a silent, watchful guardian. The new day dawned with a quiet reverence. Light trickled into the canyon, a slow, golden tide that touched the tops of the sandstone cliffs first, then crept down the walls, setting the rock ablaze with color. Mira woke to the gentle sound of the stream and the sight of Calder already awake, sitting with his back against the rock, cleaning his pistol. The task was as methodical and patient as his mending of the rain. He had disassembled the firearm into its constituent parts, which lay on a piece of oiled cloth. He worked with a soft rag and a small bottle of oil, wiping away the fine desert dust from the cylinder, the barrel, the trigger mechanism. It was the work of a man whose life depended on the reliability of his tools. Yet, watching him, Mira felt no fear. The gun in his hands was not a threat. It was a symbol of the harsh reality he navigated, and the same hands that now cleaned it with such deadly precision had held her safe on the back of his horse. She sat up, pushing the hair back from her face. He acknowledged her with a slight nod, his eyes not leaving his work. A comfortable quiet settled between them, the quiet of two people who no longer needed to fill the space with words. It was then that she saw it. On the side of his chambray shirt, just below the ribs, was a long, L-shaped tear. The fabric was ripped clean through, a ragged wound in the faded blue cloth. She knew instantly how it had happened. It was from their desperate flight through the cholla cactus field. A grasping, thorny arm had reached for them, and he, sitting behind her, had taken the damage meant for her. He had not said a word, had not even flinched. The realization sent a pang of something sharp and warm through her chest. Without a word, she reached for her calico bag. Her fingers closed around the familiar, comforting shape of the spool of silver thread and a small deerskin pouch that held her needles and a thimble. This was her world. This was her language. He had his tools of survival, and she had hers. He finished cleaning the pistol, reassembling it with the same fluid economy of motion. He laid the finished weapon aside and began to build a small fire for coffee. As he worked, Mira rose and came to stand before him. She held out her hand, not in a plea, but in a simple, direct request. "Your shirt," she said, her voice soft but clear. He looked from her outstretched hand to her face, his gray eyes questioning. "It's torn," she explained, gesturing toward the rip. "Let me mend it." He hesitated. A shirt was a simple thing, but in the intimacy of their strange, shared solitude, the request was something more. To let her mend his shirt was to let her in, to allow a gesture of care that was profoundly personal. He looked at the tear as if noticing it for the first time, then back at her. In her eyes, he saw not pity, but purpose. He saw the seamstress's daughter. Slowly, he stood up. He unbuttoned the shirt, his calloused fingers fumbling slightly with the small pearl buttons. He pulled it off, revealing a plain undershirt and a body that was lean and hard, all corded muscle and sun-darkened skin. He handed the shirt to her. It was warm from his body and smelled of him of smoke, leather, and the faint, clean scent of the desert. Mira took the garment and returned to her spot by the nascent fire. She spread the shirt across her lap, her fingers tracing the ragged edges of the tear. The fabric was coarse, worn thin and soft with countless washings. It was a working man's shirt, honest and unadorned. She threaded her finest needle not with cotton, but with the gleaming silver thread from her spool. It was the only thread she had that was worthy of the task. Calder sat down again across from her, nursing his coffee, and watched. He didn't speak. He simply watched her hands. Mira worked with a quiet, intense focus. Her mother had taught her that mending was an art of restoration. "You aren't just closing a hole," she would say. "You are honoring the life the cloth has lived." She did not simply sew the rip shut. First, she carefully trimmed the frayed edges. Then, folding the raw edge under, she began to close the tear with a series of tiny, almost invisible slip stitches, her needle dipping in and out of the fabric with a practiced, rhythmic grace. Calder found he could not look away. He had seen women sew before. Of course, in town or on ranches. It was a common, domestic task. But this was different. The way she bent her head, a stray lock of dark hair falling across her cheek, the intense concentration in her brow, and her hands. They moved with a certainty and a delicacy that seemed at odds with the harsh world they now inhabited. He noticed, then, that they were trembling. Not from fear, not from cold, but with a fine, minute tremor that spoke of the day's fatigue and the emotional weight of her task. This was not just a repair. This was a sacrament. This was her answer to his promise. She finished the first line of stitches, closing the wound in the fabric, but she wasn't done. She turned the shirt over and began to reinforce the seam from the inside, using a strong, intricate pattern of back stitches, each one precisely placed, a line of silver armor against future strain. The silver thread stood out against the faded blue, a shimmering, luminous scar. It was beautiful. It was the mark of a thing that had been broken and made whole again, and was stronger for it. The sun was high and warm by the time she was finished. She bit the thread with her teeth, knotted it, and smoothed the mended fabric with the palm of her hand. The tear was gone, replaced by a seam of moonlight. She folded the shirt neatly and held it out to him. He took it from her, his rough fingers brushing against hers. The brief contact sent a jolt of warmth through her arm. He looked down at the seam, tracing the line of silver stitches with his thumb. A long, unreadable silence stretched between them. Mira thought he would put it on. Instead, he folded it again, with a care he usually reserved for his saddle or his gun, and walked over to his horse. He untied his saddlebag and carefully placed the mended shirt inside, tucking it deep beneath his other sparse belonging. He came back to the fire and looked down at her, his expression serious. "Some things stitched by hand," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur, "last longer than bullets." The words settled into the quiet space between them, more meaningful than any flowery declaration of gratitude. He was telling her that her act of care, this small, quiet gesture, had a permanence and a power that transcended the violence of the world he lived in. He had taken her gift and made it a treasure. Mira felt a blush rise in her cheeks, and she looked down, suddenly shy. The afternoon passed in a slow, peaceful rhythm. The tension of the chase had been replaced by a languid ease. After they had eaten, Calder stood and picked up a length of twine from his saddlebag. "Stream's deep enough here," he said. "Might be fish." He fashioned a simple hook from a piece of wire and baited it with a small piece of dried meat. He found a long, straight branch from a dead juniper to serve as a pole. He was a man who could conjure survival from the most basic elements. He went to the deepest part of the pool, where the water was a cool, dark green, and cast his line. Mira followed and sat on a sun-warmed rock nearby, content to watch. The light filtered down into the canyon, dappling the water and the rock walls. The only sounds were the buzz of a lazy fly and the gentle trickle of the stream. They didn't speak for a long time. There was no need. They were simply existing in the same space, sharing the profound peace of their hidden sanctuary. After a while, he glanced over at her. She was watching the water, her face relaxed. The fear and worry that had been etched there now smoothed away. She looked younger, more like the 19-year-old girl she was. She felt his gaze and turned to look at him. Their eyes met across the space of a few feet. It was not a fleeting glance. This time, neither of them looked away. His pale gray eyes, usually so guarded and watchful, were calm, and they held a question she could not name. She held his gaze, her heart giving a slow, heavy beat. In that long, silent look, something shifted. The invisible wall between the rescuer and the rescued, between the stranger and the stranger, dissolved. They were just a man and a woman, sitting by a stream in a hidden corner of the world. A sudden tug on the line broke the spell. Calder reacted instantly, his focus snapping back to the task at hand. He played the line skillfully, letting it run, then drawing it in. And with a final, expert flick of his wrist, he pulled a small, silver-sided trout from the water. It flopped on the sandy bank, a flash of life in the afternoon sun. He looked from the fish back to her, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it transformed his hard, weary face. Mira smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. And in that shared moment of simple triumph, a new thread was stitched between them, not of silver or linen, but of something far more delicate and infinitely stronger. 2 days bled into 3. The hollow became their world, a universe contained within walls of red stone. The frantic, desperate rhythm of the chase slowed to the gentle, steady pulse of survival. A quiet routine took root, as simple and essential as the junipers clinging to the rock. Mornings were for checking on valor and replenishing the wood pile. Afternoons were for the quiet pursuit of food, another fish from the stream. The checking of snares Calder had expertly fashioned from twine and twigs. Evenings were for the fire, a silent communion that had become more comfortable than any conversation Mira had ever known. The immediate, heart-pounding fear of Silas Thorne and his men began to recede. It was still there, a dark stain on the horizon of her thoughts. But the constant, pressing terror was replaced by the deep peace of their sanctuary. Here, she was not a runaway wife or a piece of property. Here, she was just Mira, and he was just Calder. They had been stripped of their pasts and their futures, existing only in the profound, elemental now. It was on the 4th day, while exploring the upper ledges of the canyon in search of more seasoned firewood, that she found it. The sun was hot on her back, the rock face radiating a dry, ancient heat. She was in a place of profound sterility, a world of stone, sand, and relentless sun. Everything was sharp angles and pale, washed-out colors. And then she saw it. Growing from a hairline fracture in a massive slab of sandstone was a single, impossible bloom. It was a desert primrose, its petals the color of a faded blush. So delicate they were nearly translucent. The flower was no bigger than a silver dollar, its center a bright, hopeful yellow. It grew on a short, hairy stem with a small rosette of gray-green leaves pressed flat against the rock. There was no soil to be seen, no source of sustenance. It was a life force that had taken root in sheer stone, its existence a defiant, beautiful miracle against all odds. Mira knelt, her breath catching in her throat. She reached out a hesitant finger and gently touched one of the petals. It was as soft as worn silk. She looked at its tenacious grip on the rock, its fragile beauty flourishing in a place where nothing else could grow. And in that small, brave flower, she saw a reflection of the feeling that had taken root in her own heart. It was a feeling as unlikely and as unexpected as this bloom. It had grown in a place of fear and desperation. Nurtured by shared silence and quiet acts of care, It was a fragile, tender thing, yet it possessed a strength that astounded her. Like the flower, it had found a crack in the hard, rocky exterior of her fear and had pushed its way toward the light. She knew she had to preserve it. This moment, this feeling, this tiny symbol of hope in the wilderness. Returning to their camp, she retrieved the small, leather-bound notebook from her calico bag. It was another relic from her previous life, a book her mother had given her. It wasn't a diary for words, but for impressions. Inside were the pressed, faded forms of a columbine from a mountain meadow, an oak leaf from the town square in Prescott, a sprig of lavender from her mother's windowsill. It was a catalogue of a life she thought was gone forever. Carefully, she made a space between a page with a faded fern and a blank one. She went back to the flower. It felt like a small sacrilege to pick it, to end its brave struggle, but she knew it would wither and die in the sun soon enough. This way, it could be remembered. With a gentle tug, she plucked the stem and carried it back to the camp. She laid it carefully within the pages of the book, arranging the petals just so, and closed the cover, pressing it flat with the palm of her hand. A desert bloom, captured and kept. That evening, the familiar ritual of the fire played out. They had eaten a small meal of roasted rabbit, and the comfortable silence had settled around them. The canyon was filled with the deep purple shadows of twilight, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the strip of sky visible above. Calder was sitting cross-legged, working by the firelight. He was not mending this time, but braiding. He was crafting a new lash for his quirt from thin strips of rawhide, his fingers moving in a complex, mesmerizing pattern. Mira watched him for a long time, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. The notebook felt heavy in her lap. The gift of the mended shirt had been her thanks for his protection. This was something else. This was not a payment or a trade. This was a confession. It was the only way she knew how to show him the bloom that had taken root inside her. Taking a deep breath, she rose. She walked the few steps to his side of the fire. He looked up from his work, his hands stilling, his gray eyes questioning in the firelight. She didn't speak. She knelt beside him and placed the open notebook on the sand, right next to his hand. The book was open to the page where the primrose lay. Its delicate pink and yellow colors were a startling contrast to the stark brown of the page and the sand. A single fragile splash of life. She didn't wait for a reaction. As soon as the book was placed, she retreated to her own side of the fire, her cheeks hot, her heart thrumming. She had said everything she knew how to say. The rest was up to him. Calder looked down at the book. He stared at the small, pressed flower for a long time. His expression was unreadable, carved into stillness by the flickering shadows. He was a man of the desert. He understood what it meant for a thing to grow in stone. He knew the impossible resilience it required. He looked from the flower to her, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. He did not smile, but he gave her a slow, deliberate nod. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of understanding. He had heard her. He reached out, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle, and closed the book. He did not give it back to her. He set it carefully beside him, a treasure to be guarded. Then he picked up his rawhide strips and, without another glance, resumed his braiding. The conversation was over. The message had been received. The next morning, Mira woke with the first light. Calder was already gone, likely checking the snares or seeing to the horse. The air was cool and sweet. In the spot where she had been sleeping, nestled in the soft sand beside her bedroll, lay a small, coiled object. It was a bracelet. It was fashioned from a single, continuous strip of dark, supple leather, braided into a neat, intricate pattern. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the braid tight and uniform, a testament to the patient skill she had witnessed the night before. But it was what he had woven into the braid that made her breath catch in her throat. Running through the center of the dark leather, a shimmering, incandescent line, was a strand of her silver thread. He must have done it after she had fallen asleep, working by the dying embers of the fire. He had taken the symbol of her past, the thread she had clung to as the last remnant of her identity, and had literally woven it into the fabric of his own world. He had intertwined the strong, rugged leather of his life with the delicate, shining thread of hers. She picked it up. It was light but strong, and it felt warm in her hand. It was not a flower that would fade. It was not a pretty, useless trinket. It was something made to last. It was a promise, a story, a shared secret made tangible. It was his answer. She slipped it over her wrist. The braid was a perfect fit, a circle of dark leather and bright silver against her skin. It felt as if it had always been there. When he returned a short while later, a brace of quail in his hand, his eyes went immediately to her wrist. He saw the bracelet there. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Mira held up her arm, letting the morning sun catch the silver thread, making it flash like a captured star. She looked at him, and her smile was all the thanks he would ever need. They had created a language all their own, a language of mending and mementos, of things found and things made. It was a language of survival, and she was beginning to understand, the language of love. The piece of the hollow was a fragile, hand-blown glass vessel, and it was shattered by the sound of a single, dislodged stone. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting into the canyon, painting long, distorted shadows on the rock walls. The air was warm and still. Calder was reshoeing Valor, his back to the canyon entrance. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his hammer, a familiar, comforting sound. Mira was by the stream, washing their tin plates. The silver and leather bracelet, a cool, solid weight on her wrist. She was humming softly, a tune her mother used to sing. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she felt a sense of home. The sound was small, a single clatter of a rock falling from the canyon rim high above. It was a sound that could have been caused by a wild goat or the simple mechanics of erosion, but it was enough. Calder froze. The hammer in his hand stopped mid-swing. His head came up, his whole body going rigid. He was listening, not with his ears, but with his entire being. He had survived this long by paying attention to the small sounds that were out of place. Mira saw the change in him, and her own blood ran cold, the humming dying in her throat. He put a single finger to his lips, his eyes locking on hers. Silence. Then came a second sound, louder this time, the unmistakable metallic scrape of a boot iron against rock. It came from the canyon mouth. They had been found. The idyllic sanctuary transformed instantly into a kill box. The high enclosing walls that had offered shelter now provided perfect vantage points for an ambush. There was only one way out, and it was blocked. Panic, a familiar, nauseating specter, rose in Mira's throat. But this time, something else rose with it, the echo of a man's voice saying, "That's survival, not sin." Calder moved with a speed that was terrifyingly fluid. He dropped the hammer, snatched his rifle from where it leaned against the rock, and grabbed his holstered pistol, shoving it into Mira's hands. The weight of the Colt revolver was shocking, a dense, cold, alien thing. It felt impossibly heavy, a tool of death she had only ever seen from a distance. "Get back," he hissed, his voice a low, deadly command. "Behind the rocks, by the stream, don't make a sound, don't move, no matter what you hear." He didn't wait for an answer. He shoved her backward, pushing her toward the deepest part of the hollow where a jumble of large boulders offered the only real cover. He then spun and dove behind the low wall of the old fire pit, leveling the rifle toward the canyon entrance. He was a shadow against the sand, a part of the landscape, his body a low, dangerous line. Mira stumbled backward, her legs trembling, the heavy pistol held awkwardly in both hands. She scrambled behind the boulders, her back pressing into the cold, solid rock. Her heart was a wild bird beating itself against the cage of her ribs, peeking through a narrow gap. She could see the canyon mouth, a V-shaped slice of blindingly bright sunlight. Two figures appeared in that vapor silhouettes against the glare, then a third and a fourth. They were on foot, moving cautiously, rifles held at the ready. They were Thorne's men. She recognized one of them, a lanky, cruel-faced man named Jebediah, who acted as Thorne's foreman. They were in the canyon. The trap was sprung. The world exploded in a deafening roar. Calder fired first. The report of his rifle was a physical blow, a crack of thunder that echoed off the canyon walls. One of the silhouettes staggered and fell, a cry of pain swallowed by the echoing blast. The other three men scattered, diving for cover behind the rocks and scrub at the canyon's entrance. The air was instantly filled with the angry whine of bullets. Lead spanged off the rock face high above Mira's head, sending chips of sandstone flying. Another shot kicked up a puff of sand just inches from where Calder lay. He was pinned down. Mira watched in horror, her knuckles white on the grip of the pistol. This was not a fight. It was an execution. 3 rifles against 1. Calder fired again, the movement economical and precise. He wasn't firing wildly. Each shot was aimed, designed to keep their heads down, to buy seconds. But Mira could see it was a losing battle. They had him trapped. They could wait him out, or simply overwhelm him with a sheer volume of fire. Jebediah's voice, rough and full of malice, echoed through the canyon. "Give up the girl. Calder, mister. Thorne only wants what's his. You can walk away." Calder's answer was another rifle shot that sent Jebediah diving back behind his rock. Mira's mind was screaming. She was the cause of this. This good, quiet man was going to die because of her. The guilt was a physical sickness, more terrifying than the bullets. She saw her life spooling out. Either she would be dragged back to Thorne's gilded cage, or she would die here in this canyon. Her body left for the vultures alongside the man who had tried to save her. But then she felt the cold, hard weight of the gun in her hands. She thought of the silver thread he had woven into the leather bracelet on her wrist, a thing made to last. She thought of his face in the firelight, the weariness in his eyes when he had looked at her and understood. Every thread. A cold, clear resolve cut through her panic. It was the resolve of the desert primrose, blooming in stone. It was survival. Jebediah and another man began to lay down a covering fire, their bullets hammering the area around the fire pit. The third man, using their distraction, broke from cover. He began scrambling up the side of the canyon wall, aiming for a high ledge that would give him a clear, plunging shot down into Calder's position. Calder saw him. He shifted his aim, firing at the climbing man. But in that split second, as his attention was diverted, Jebediah rose from behind his rock, his own rifle leveled. It all happened in a horrifying instant of slow motion. Calder, realizing his mistake, tried to swing his rifle back. Mira saw the flash from Jebediah's barrel. She saw Calder's body jolt, a violent, unnatural spasm. He cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain, and his rifle clattered to the sand as he slumped behind the low wall. He was hit. The world went silent for Mira. The sound of the gunshots, the whining bullets, the angry shouts, it all faded away, replaced by a deafening roar in her own ears. The man who had promised her safety was lying wounded in the sand, and the man on the ledge was still climbing. She moved. It was not a conscious decision. Her body simply acted. She scrambled out from behind the boulders, her knees scraping on the rough ground. She ran, low and fast, to where Calder lay. His eyes were closed, his face pale and slick with sweat. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his shoulder and chest, the same shoulder that had been a solid wall for her to lean against on their desperate ride. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. His rifle lay just out of his reach. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the rifle. It was heavier than the pistol, long and unwieldy. She had seen her father hunt, but she had never held a weapon like this. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely work the lever action to chamber a new round. The metallic click seemed as loud as a gunshot in the ringing silence. The man on the ledge had reached his destination. He was kneeling, taking careful aim down at Calder's exposed position. At her position. Mira rested the heavy barrel of the rifle on the low stone wall of the fire pit, just as she had seen Calder do. She tried to line up the sights, but they danced and blurred before her swimming eyes. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the man's unseen gaze on her, a predator about to strike. She took a breath. She closed her eyes for a single second and saw a flash of memory, her mother's hands, steady and sure, guiding a needle through a fine piece of silk. A good stitch holds the world together. She opened her eyes. She stopped trying to aim perfectly. She looked at the man on the ledge, a dark shape against the sky. She pointed the rifle at him, braced her shoulder against the stock, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was a brutal, physical punch, slamming into her shoulder and knocking her backward. The blast was deafening. For a moment, she was blind and deaf, her senses overwhelmed. She didn't know if she had hit him. But the shooting from the canyon mouth stopped. She heard a curse, sharp and clear. From the ledge. The man was not hit, but the bullet must have struck the rock right beside him, spraying his face with stone splinters. He had scrambled back from the edge, his nerve broken. He had expected to be shooting a wounded man, not to be fired upon by a ghost. A tense, ringing silence fell over the canyon. Jebediah's voice called out, hesitant now. "Who's that Calder?" Mira didn't answer. She levered another round into the chamber, the action clumsy but successful. She kept the rifle aimed at the canyon mouth. Her hands were still shaking, but the gun felt a little lighter now, a little more familiar. It was a tool, and she knew how to use tools. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity. The sun crept lower, plunging the canyon into deep shadow. The men at the entrance were spooked. Their tactical advantage was gone. The wounded man was no longer an easy target, and they had no idea who else was in the hollow with him. They had lost the element of surprise, and one of their own was down. From the canyon mouth, she heard low, urgent whispers, then the sound of them dragging their fallen companion away. And then, silence. They were gone. For a long time, Mira didn't move. She stayed behind the wall, rifle ready, listening to the silence, waiting for the trick. But the silence remained unbroken, except for the gentle trickle of the stream and the ragged, painful sound of Calder's breathing. When she was finally sure they were gone, she let the rifle fall. The strength went out of her in a single, shuddering wave. She crawled to Calder's side. He was conscious, his pale eyes open and looking at her. The front of his shirt was soaked in blood. She gently tore the fabric away. The bullet had gone in high on his shoulder, tearing a ragged path through muscle. It was bad, but it might have missed the lung. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice cracking. His eyes fluttered, his face tight with pain. He tried to speak, but it came out as a pained cough. He lifted his hand, his movement slow and agonizingly weak. It was his left hand, the uninjured one. He didn't reach for his wound. He didn't reach for a weapon. His hand moved through the space between them, searching. His fingers found her wrist, right where the leather and silver bracelet rested against her skin. His grip was faint, a mere ghost of its former strength, but it was there. His eyes found hers, and his voice was a dry, rasping whisper, a thread of sound in the growing dark. "You still safe?" Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back began to stream down her face, hot against her cold skin. She looked at his pale face, at the blood on his shirt, at the immense sacrifice he had made for her. She looked at his hand, still clinging to her wrist, his first and only concern. She leaned in close, her tears falling onto his cheek, and her own voice was a whisper, thick with a love so fierce it was an ache in her chest. "Because of you." The journey out of the canyon was a slow, agonizing crawl back into the world of the living. Calder, feverish and weak from blood loss, was a dead weight in the saddle. Mira, In a reversal of roles that felt both terrifying and profound, was now the protector, the guide, the one whose will alone kept them moving forward. She walked beside Valor, one hand on the bridle, the other often resting on Calder's leg to steady him, her gaze constantly scanning the horizon for threats that had nothing to do with men and guns, the threat of no water, of a wrong turn, of a sun that gave no quarter. She tended to his wound with a seamstress's precision, using whiskey from his flask to clean it and strips torn from her own petticoat for bandages. She stitched the worst of the gash closed with her own fine needle and thread, not the silver, but a sturdy cotton, her movement sure and steady despite the tremor in her heart. She was mending him, just as she had mended his shirt, her stitches a desperate, silent prayer against the fever that burned in his skin. On the third day, when their water was nearly gone and Mira's own hope had worn thin as an old thread, they saw it. Not a mirage, but the dark, life-giving green of cottonwood trees, a sure sign of a river. And nestled in a gentle curve of that river was a town. It wasn't much, a single dusty street, a general store with a sagging porch, a blacksmith's forge, a small church whose steeple seemed to lean with the prevailing wind, and a collection of weathered houses. The sign at the edge of the town was so faded the name was nearly illegible, but she could just make out the words, Rio Perdido, the Lost River. It was a place one found by accident, a quiet backwater forgotten by the relentless push of progress. It was perfect. Their arrival caused a small, silent stir. The sight of a pale, exhausted woman leading a horse that carried a wounded, half-conscious man was enough to draw curious eyes from behind curtained windows. But no one approached. This was a town that respected privacy, that understood some stories were best left untold. Mira found the town doctor, a weary, kind-eyed man named Elias, who wordlessly helped her get Calder into a small room behind his surgery. He dug the bullet from Calder's shoulder, grunting with satisfaction when it was out, and declared that the cowboy was lucky and tough, and would likely live, provided the fever broke. The fever did break, after 2 long nights of Mira sitting by his bedside, bathing his face with cool water from the river. During those long hours, she watched him, his hard face softened and made vulnerable by pain, and knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that her life was now inextricably bound to his. The threads were no longer just symbolic. They were woven into the very fabric of her soul. When Calder was finally strong enough to stand, they had nothing. The money she'd had was gone, paid to the doctor for medicine and lodging. They were adrift, but for the first time, Mira was not afraid. Calder, though still weak, was a man who could not be idle. He found them shelter, not in a room for rent, but in a derelict structure at the edge of town. It was the old post office, long abandoned when a new one was built. The roof leaked and the windows were broken, but the walls were solid. With a quiet determination, he set about making it habitable. He bartered a day's labor mending the blacksmith's fence with his good arm for a piece of canvas and some old timber. He patched the roof, covered the windows, and built a sturdy lean-to against one wall. It wasn't a house. It was a camp, a shelter, but it was theirs. While he worked, building their physical world, Mira began to build their social one. She took her small deerskin pouch of needles and her precious spool of silver thread to the general store and spoke to the owner's wife, a stern-faced but practical woman named Martha. Mira didn't ask for charity. She asked for work. She showed Martha the intricate silver stitches on Calder's folded shirt, which she now kept wrapped in cloth like a holy relic. Martha was skeptical, but she had a pile of mending her husband's work pants, her son's torn shirts, a tablecloth with a coffee stain. "Let's see what you can do," she said, her tone leaving no room for failure. Mira set up a small corner for herself in their lean-to, with a single chair and a crate for a table, and there, in the soft light that filtered through the canvas, she worked her quiet magic. She didn't just patch, she restored. She rewove the fabric on the work pants until the hole was nearly invisible. She embroidered a small, cheerful bluebird over the stain on the tablecloth, transforming a flaw into a feature. When she returned the items, Martha was silent for a long moment, her practical eyes examining every stitch. She looked at the bluebird, then at Mira. A slow, grudging respect dawned in her expression. She paid Mira not in coin, but in flour, salt, and a side of bacon. More importantly, she began to talk. And so, slowly, the town came to them. A farmer with a horse blanket that needed mending. A young mother with a baby's christening gown that had been passed down and needed delicate repairs. A shy schoolteacher who had snagged her only good dress. Mira met them all with a quiet dignity. She listened to their stories, which were woven into the very fabric of the clothes they brought her. She learned the town's rhythms, its small joys and sorrows, one stitch at a time. Her skill was her letter of introduction, her needle and thread the tools with which she stitched herself and Calder into the community of Rio Perdido. One afternoon, an elderly woman named Agnes Gable, the town's unofficial matriarch, came to their lean-to. Her face was a fine-spun web of wrinkles, and her eyes were a sharp, intelligent blue. She carried a large, bundled object in her arms. "Heard you were the miracle worker," she said, her voice a dry rustle. She laid the bundle on Mira's crate. It was a dress, or rather, it had once been a dress. The fabric, a fine lawn, was yellowed with age and stained. The lace at the collar was torn, and several of the seams had given way entirely. It looked like a fragile, discarded husk. "It was my daughter's, Mrs., Gable said, her voice softening. "She passed on some years ago. I kept it, but, well, it's no good to anyone like this. See if you can make something of it. If not, just use the fabric for rags." It was more than a dress. It was a gift of trust. It was a test. For 3 days, Mira worked on the dress. It became an obsession. This was not a repair. It was a resurrection. First, she unpicked every single seam, deconstructing the garment back into its original, constituent pieces. She washed each piece by hand in the river, using a gentle soap made of lye and ash, and laid them out on the sun-warmed rocks to dry. The sun, her former enemy, now became her ally, bleaching the yellowed fabric back to a soft, creamy white. The stains were stubborn, but she worked on them with lemon juice and patience until they were mere ghosts of what they had been. She sacrificed the torn lace at the collar, but saved a small, perfect section from the cuffs. She recut the fabric, her shears moving with a renewed confidence. The old, fussy design of the dress disappeared, replaced by simple, clean lines. A modest, scooped neckline, a fitted bodice, a skirt that would fall to her ankles. It was a dress born not of fashion, but of grace. She stitched it all back together, her needle flying. This was the work she had been born to do. As she sewed, she felt she was not just remaking a dress, but remaking herself. She was cutting away the past, trimming the frayed edges of her fear, and stitching a new future from the remnants. When it was done, she took the small, perfect piece of lace she had saved and, with her silver thread, attached it to the bodice, right over the heart. A single, shimmering detail, a tribute to the past and a promise for the future. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the canyon walls, casting the world in a warm, honey-gold light, she put it on. The fabric was soft against her skin. It fit as if it were made for her. It was a simple dress, yet in it, she felt more beautiful, more herself, than she ever had in the silks and satins Silas Thorne had forced upon her. Calder was sitting on a log outside their shelter, watching the river flow by. He had been quiet all day, watching her work, a silent, steady presence. His shoulder was healing, the wound closing into a clean scar. The hardness in his face had eased over their weeks in Rio Perdido. the lines of weariness replaced by a quiet contentment. She walked out of the lean-to and stood before him. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She just stood there in the golden light, the simple white dress a beacon in the twilight, her hands clasped before her. He looked up at her, and the idle whittling he was doing stopped. His hands went still. His gaze traveled from her bare feet in the dust up the simple lines of the dress, to the single piece of silver-stitched lace over her heart, and finally, to her face. He looked at her for a long, silent moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he did something she had never seen him do for anyone. He took off his hat, holding the dusty brim in both hands, and rested it on his knee. It was a gesture of profound, almost holy, respect. He lowered his head slightly, as if in the presence of something sacred. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and rough with an emotion she had never heard in it before. "You look like home." The words were simple. They were not a compliment on the dress. They were not a declaration of beauty. They were a statement of fact, a confession. For a man who had known no home but the trail, no roof but the stars, it was the greatest declaration of love he could possibly make. She was his destination. She was the end of his wandering. Mira's eyes filled with tears, but she did not let them fall. She simply smiled at him, a smile that was full of the quiet, miraculous peace of a long-settled dust. Summer settled over Rio Perdido like a warm, worn blanket. The blistering, aggressive heat of the deep desert was tamed here by the river, which exhaled a cool, life-giving breath each evening. The days were long and golden, the nights soft and filled with the gentle chorus of crickets and the distant, soothing murmur of the water flowing over stones. The old post office was no longer a derelict shell or a temporary camp. It was a home. Calder, with the patient, unhurried skill he applied to everything, had transformed it. He had replaced the canvas patches with real glass in the windows, bartered from a traveling merchant. He had built a wide, covered porch that faced the river, using seasoned cottonwood planks that were smooth and warm under bare feet. The lean-to was now a proper workshop for his leatherwork, and the main room was filled with the scent of Mira's cooking and the quiet order of their shared life. They had become a part of the town's gentle rhythm. Calder was the man you went to when a saddle needed more than a simple patch, when a harness for a plow team needed to be crafted with strength and integrity. He spoke little, but his work spoke for him, each piece a testament to his quiet competence. Mira was the woman who could save a cherished heirloom, who could turn a stained tablecloth into a thing of beauty, whose stitches were so fine they seemed to be woven by moonlight. She had a small, hand-painted sign hanging from a porch post, a simple board that read, M. Calder, seamstress, fine mending and embroidery. The M was for Mira, but the Calder was a quiet, unstated fact that the town had accepted as easily as it accepted the rising of the sun. This evening was like many others, steeped in a peace so profound it felt like a prayer. The sun had set, leaving the sky a deep, velvety indigo pricked with the first diamonds of starlight. A single lantern cast a warm, golden glow across the porch, creating a small island of light in the gathering dark. Calder sat on a low stool, his back against a porch post. In his lap was a piece of his bridle, the headstall, where the leather had begun to crack and fray from years of sun and sweat. He was not merely patching it. He was painstakingly restitching the entire length with waxed thread, his awl and needle moving in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The work was familiar, comforting. It was the same task he had been performing in the gloom of the way station the day he had first met her, but everything was different now. Then, the work had been a shield, a way to occupy his hands and mind in the presence of a stranger. Now, it was an act of contentment, a quiet chore performed in the safety of his own home, in the presence of his own heart. Mira sat in a simple rocking chair opposite him, the chair a gift from the town carpenter, whose wife's wedding dress Mira had restored. In her hands was a pair of wooden knitting needles, and they clicked together softly, a gentle counterpoint to the scrape of Calder's awl. She was knitting a small, soft shawl from a skein of undyed wool. It was for the blacksmith's new baby, due in the fall. Her work was no longer about desperate survival, about patching the wounds of the past. It was about creating comfort, about weaving warmth for a future she had never expected to have. The silver bracelet he had made for her was a cool, familiar weight on her wrist, the silver catching the lantern light with every flick of her needles. For a long time, they didn't speak. The silence between them was a living thing, woven from shared memories and an understanding that ran deeper than words. It was filled with the scent of the river, the dry perfume of the sagebrush, and the faint, clean smell of the soap Mira used to wash their clothes. It was the sound of peace. Mira paused in her knitting, her hands resting in her lap. She looked at Calder. The lantern light carved his face from the shadows, highlighting the strong line of his jaw, the quiet concentration in his brow. She watched his calloused, capable hands as they pushed the needle through the tough leather, drawing the thread tight, the same hands that had pulled her from the brink of a fall, that had wielded a rifle in her defense, that had healed and built and provided. She thought of their journey, the dust and the fear, the desperate flight across the cactus flats, the shared terror and the whispered promises in the secret hollow. It all felt like another lifetime, a story that had happened to two other people, and yet it was the foundation upon which this quiet, beautiful life had been built. Every stitch of their present was sewn with the threads of their past. A wave of emotion so powerful it was almost painful washed over her. It was a fierce, protective love for this moment, for this man, for this life that felt as fragile and as miraculous as a flower blooming in rock. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely more than a whisper, a soft thread of sound in the vast, quiet tapestry of the night. "Will you remember this?" It was not the same question she had asked him in the hollow. Then, her question had been born of fear, the fear of being a footnote, a forgotten chapter in his solitary life. "Will you remember me?" she had asked. Tonight, her question was born of love, the love of a present so precious she wanted to capture it, to hold it, to ensure it would never be forgotten. Not just the memory of her, but the memory of this, the scent of the air, the sound of the river, the feeling of the warm wood of the porch beneath their feet, the shared, quiet contentment of two broken people who had, against all odds, mended each other and built a home. Calder's hands stilled. He slowly lowered the piece of leather to his lap. The awl and needle rested in his palm. He lifted his head and looked at her, his pale gray eyes luminous in the lantern light. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, his gaze holding hers, a long, silent conversation passing between them. Then he leaned forward. He reached across the small space that separated them, his movement deliberate and full of a gentle gravity. He did not take her hand. Instead, his rough, warm fingers gently closed around her wrist. His touch was so light it was barely a pressure, his thumb coming to rest directly over the silver and leather bracelet he had made for her. It was the same wrist he had grabbed to pull her onto his horse in the frantic escape from the way station. It was the same wrist his weak, searching fingers had found in the bloody aftermath of the gunfight. It was the place where the last of the faint, yellowed bruises from Silas Thorne's cruel grip had finally, completely healed, leaving her skin smooth and unmarred beneath the symbol of Calder's love. He looked from her eyes down to his hand covering her wrist, then back to her eyes again. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. His voice was a low, rough murmur, the sound of stones worn smooth by the river, and it held the weight of an unbreakable vow. Every thread. Behind them, hanging from the eaves of the porch, were several dozen small, shimmering decorations that twisted and danced in the gentle night breeze. They were leftover strands from Mira's spool of silver thread, each one carefully tied to a piece of twine. They were her sign, her trademark, a small touch of beauty for the home she had made. in the darkness. The lantern light caught them, and they glittered and flashed, a constellation of tiny, man-made stars. Their love, born in the harsh, unforgiving desert, had found its quiet harbor. It was not a love of grand declarations or flowery promises, but one built of small, tangible acts: a mended shirt, a piece of bread, a shared blanket, a braided bracelet. It was a quiet, resilient thing, as durable and as beautiful as a seam of silver thread, stitching two tattered lives together, making them whole.
Thank you for listening. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like the video, and hit that hype button to help more people hear this story.